Kia ora, I'm Erica Wilkinson, and this is the Doc Sounds of Science podcast. Kia ora, ko Erica Wilkinson tēnei. He konei I pirangi tēnei e pa ana ki ngā Sounds of Science. Every episode, we talk about work being done behind the scenes by Doc's technical experts, scientists, rangers, and the experts in between. Kia ora koutou katoa, hello to you all. I'm thrilled to welcome to the show flora, fauna and deer expert, George Ledgard. George is a keen hunter and a technical advisor at the department. We're talking to him about what it's like to wear both those hats and to learn about ungulates, starting with what are ungulates. But before that, welcome, George.
Kia ora, Erica.
Would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, tēnā koe. Ko George Ledgard tōku ingoa, ko mātanga mātai te papa atawhai, ko maukateri te maunga, ko rakahuri te aoa, ko te anau ahau. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora. So first and foremost, what do you do at DOC?
I'm a technical advisor in the landscape threats teams, but principally I advise on wild animals.
Cool. And did you always want to do this for a job?
Kind of. Always wanted to live in a place that I was near mountains, particularly in the high country. As a really young child, I remember in the car looking out at helicopters and always saying to my mum I wanted to fly a helicopter. And the sort of backup option was going to be a high country farmer or something like that. But mum, coming from a high country farm sort of during the 80s, said that's not a good idea. And they also knew quite a few helicopter pilots, some of who died in the industry during the deer recovery days. So they didn't want me to do that either. So I naturally ended up in a space where I could experience all of those things in beautiful places. Yeah.
Pretty perfect. Now, talking to an ungulate expert, can you tell me what is an ungulate?
Well, basically, ungulates are hooved animals, so anything from a horse to a tapir to a tar to a goat to a deer. But interestingly enough, they also include cetaceans, which are whales and dolphins.
They don't have hooves.
No, I know, but they're classed as an ungulate. Yeah, so it's probably quite a broad definition for what I deal with in DOC, because obviously we're not dealing with controlling cetaceans.
Wow, that's fascinating. So what's the problem with ungulates?
Well, basically, New Zealand forests and ecosystems haven't adapted to mammalian tooth browsers, and when we introduce them into New Zealand, they cause large structural and compositional changes in our forests. They eliminate certain species from forest and alpine ecosystems and strongly modify our vegetation in a way that it's never been pre-exposed to. So they are a problem, and when they're unmanaged, they can get into really high numbers, and those problems are exacerbated.
And when were they introduced to New Zealand? Because they're not native.
No. So in the right from the early 1800s or mid 1800s, should I say, they were brought in sheep, and then acclimatisation societies also brought in a number of species from deer to moose, which are maybe around in Fiordland, who knows, and also a bunch of other animals that never established, such as zebras and all sorts of weird and wonderful animals were introduced by these societies all during the late 19th century.
So there's a perception that DOC hate deer and that DOC hate deer hunters. In your opinion, as an expert technical advisor at DOC and as a hunter, what would you say the truth is?
Oh, definitely not. Many of my colleagues at DOC, we are all interested in hunting and we equally value deer as a resource. It's just when they're in the wrong place and too high numbers and exert those unwanted influences on our forest ecosystem. So we're working alongside hunters and commercial hunters and things is a real key to wild animal management, alongside DOC leading some work as well.
What's the key thing you wish members of the public knew about ungulate control work?
Well, ungulate control work led by the department is governed by a bunch of animal welfare rules as well. So we're interested in dispatching animals as quickly and as humanely as possible. Equally, as I was saying before, nobody likes killing animals, but in order to protect our most vulnerable and threatened species and ecosystems, we have to manage them, and by controlling them, using lethal measures is the only option we have.
Absolutely. It's like the right species just in the wrong place, as you said. Can you tell me about a time you witnessed some of the damage that ungulate browsers have done firsthand?
Yeah, there's actually plenty of examples. In Western Fjordland, for example, recently I've been over there. We have some offshore islands that are deer-free, and I also like to go to the adjacent mainland that has plenty of deer on it. And we're seeing slips, that are caused by natural events such as storms or earthquakes. In Fjordland's example, that have been prevented from recovering in terms of the vegetation's just not coming through, the trees aren't coming through to grow over those slips, simply because we've got really high densities of ungulates, particularly in this case red deer, preventing that re-establishment. And equally in montane ecosystems where we have really high numbers of tar, you can just see all the broadleaf tussocks, which really provide that canopy cover over the soil and the other plants that live underneath it. And when they're gone, the whole place is just exposed to increased erosion. Other pests take advantage of it, such as hares, and keep that sort of turn that long stature tussock grassland into a really short stature turf community, which is far less resilient to disturbance and impacts as well.
Okay, and what do they, are they eating the understory? Are they trampling it? What are they actually doing?
A bit of everything, and it depends on which ungulate we're talking about, because we can include pigs in the suite of ungulates that are managed and cause damage in New Zealand. But for things like our most common ones, which are goats and deer, they're really preventing the regeneration of certain species within our understory. And at really high densities, they're preventing total regeneration, particularly of canopy cover species like mountain beech, which many people are familiar with. And when that stops and you get a windfall or a earthquake knocking over trees and you're not getting that regeneration coming through, that's obviously preventing or causing a complete change in the structure of the forest from a tall forest into a low stature sort of shrubland community. And that has knock-on effects for not only the flora composition, but the fauna that rely on those tall forests to exist and as food sources.
And would you say that if I haven't seen it how it was before, then I can't tell what I'm looking at afterwards or what's happened?
Yeah, totally. It's sort of that shifting baseline where my grandfather saw a forest in a certain state, but I don't see it in that state, so I don't know what it previously looked like. So we have to use things like deer exclosures, or taking people to offshore islands is a really classic example, where suddenly you just see a whole lot of species that you don't see in the adjacent area that might be occupied by ungulates. So those sort of tools are really useful in explaining to the public, because often you just can't see those subtle differences, and particularly after decades, if not hundreds of years of change, what New Zealand forests look like today are completely different to what they look like to pre-European and even pre-Polynesian arrival.
And to flip the question, in places we have done control, what are the signs of regeneration? Can you describe what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. There's certain species in our forests that we like to call ice cream species that are really highly preferred by ungulates. Deer and goats, they all seem to like the same things. And when you do control, you start to see those coming through. And as I was saying before, when you've got a forest that's been impacted by ungulates, it's really hard necessarily to know what's different from a forest free of ungulates. And often it's not so much it's vastly denser in some instances. Often it is, but you will see these subtle changes of these ice cream species such as broadleaf and three finger coming through, and you'll just notice a different architecture in the forest and a different structure, along with that compositional change that occurs when you do remove ungulates and those lovely ice cream species start to come through and flourish again.
And I've heard people say that deer and goats are just kind of filling the ecological role of moa. What do you say to that?
Well, it's simply not true. Moa are completely different. They have a beak, and they have basically a bunch of pruning shears on it, running through the forest, clipping away like topering a hedge or something like that, versus an ungulate, which will rip a whole branch or a leaf off or a shoot off right at the ground level, munch it up, put it into a really complex digestive system and spit it out the other end with no seeds in it and nothing. Whereas moa, we're clipping and pruning these species, which they had evolved with over millennia. And so moa were not exerting that, destructive effect. And they had a really simple stomach as well, which allowed the transfer of seeds through it. So they were able to, move around seed through the forest, and, which, is essential for allowing regeneration of different species in different parts of the forest. But furthermore to that, they've actually done a lot of pollen analysis on moa coprolites, which is moa dung, and compared it to deer dung in the same forest ecosystem sites. And obviously those moa were around when forests were unmodified by ungulates. And what the analysis of that pollen revealed, that was there was a whole heap of those ice cream species I referred to before in the moa coprolite dung. And today we don't see those species in the pollen counts within the deer dung, sort of illustrating that those forests back when moa were around were far more diverse. Those ice cream species were able to persist and live alongside moa, which you can understand after such a long evolutionary history. And they can't do that today. That's the simple fact. So, yeah, it's chalk and cheese, really, and that argument's just not supported by any actual factual literature.
Well, thank you for myth-busting it. That was fantastic. And while we're myth-busting, why can't we just translocate all the deer out of the way?
Because it's too expensive, and we don't really have the means to be able to do it. It's very difficult to capture deer. A lot of people were doing it in the late 70s and early 80s as part of establishing a farm deer venison industry. But those deer and hinds in particular were worth upwards of $3,000 back then. And there's a massive incentive to be able to try and capture as many deer as possible, and they simply couldn't do it back then even. It's too difficult, too expensive, and we don't really have the tools available to do it.
Another misconception is that 1080 is killing all the deer. What do you respond to that?
It's not killing all the deer. It does achieve a bykill of deer, and sometimes that's quite large, but often it's quite low. And there's a bunch of factors that contribute to how much bykill of deer there are. Often it's driven by the time of the year and also the state the deer are in. If they're really hungry and searching for food, they'll eat enough baits that will kill an animal. But there's also many instances I know of where it's had a very low bykill. In fact, in Fiordland, I shoot a number of deer out of 1080 or blocks. It certainly hasn't killed them all by any stretch of the imagination, and there are still plenty of deer around in those blocks. But it does have a variable effect based on a bunch of factors.
And it's just over-reported, I guess.
Yeah, it's sort of something that I guess people like to jump on to. It's one of those difficult ones where we can't say, no, it doesn't. It definitely does, but we're not targeting it. And there is oodles of conservation land out there that does not receive 1080. And I guess that's a really important point. If you don't want to go to a place that hasn't had 1080, there's plenty of land out there that is not managed in any way by the department that you can have access to deer or any other ungulate.
Another misconception that Doc, especially the social media team, get is that Doc must have shot all the deer because I can't find any. What can you tell me about that?
The reason I laugh is that a friend of mine in Christchurch said the same thing to me. He said he went hunting up in North Canterbury, and he said, I didn't get any deer. You guys must have gone in there and shot them all. And really genuinely, he wasn't saying it in a negative way. And I said, that's simply not the case. I sort of chuckle because the department does very little deer control at all around New Zealand. There's a few places in Fiordland we do it on offshore islands, or where we have the takahe, where we need to keep numbers low to prevent competition with the same food resources that takahe are looking for. But around the country, the department does very little deer control. And similar to 1080, there's heaps and heaps of country out there where there is no control. I think the real driver behind low deer numbers in many parts of New Zealand in the last 40 or 50 years has been the wild animal recovery industry. Like the commercial recovery of animals has had a much bigger impact than any department-led, DOC-led control.
Okay, it's interesting to know that you're getting that from your friends as well.
I guess it's an easy thing to say is, that DOC's in there. Or if somebody sees a helicopter shooting deer up a valley, they think it might be DOC, but invariably it's probably a commercial operator trying to recover venison for the federal venison market.
And as a hunter, you would have had a time where you were disappointed to go out and not find deer, right? Like it probably happens to everyone. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, plenty of times. This year I went out in the raw and had a pretty poor raw in one of the spots I usually go to, and there simply was just not very many deer to be seen. I'm sure they were there, but I just wasn't finding them. But I remember I cut my teeth hunting in the early 1990s, and it was very difficult to find deer. You know, we might see 2 or 3 deer in an overnight trip. Back then, maybe if we were lucky to get one of those deer to take home and fill the freezer. I can go to the same spots now and see 40 or 50 deer in an evening, and I don't think many people realise how lucky we are at the moment, or in terms of hunting success rates, how lucky people are with the amount of deer that are around at the moment without a commercial industry keeping numbers really low. It's never been a better time to hunt at the moment.
Tell me about a time when you were in the field and encountered something so memorable that you've looked at things differently ever since.
Yeah, I have, and it's. I was thinking about this the other day. It's a memory that comes back quite often, and it's around how the raw end of the deal that our native fauna are getting. And this was over in Western Fiordland. I was in a valley called the Kazette Burn. It turns into the Camelot River in Western Fiordland, and we had been doing some deer browse surveys in there actually. And we were sitting at camp, and it was a really miserable 24 hours. The river was up. We were almost on an island. The river had risen so much that we couldn't really travel anywhere. We were sort of stuck on an island, which is not a great feeling, but we knew the rain was going to slow down and the river levels were going to drop. So we're just at camp, and a weka ran past. And that's nothing unusual. There's weka around that part of Fiordland. And then a stoat was chasing it. And so I thought that was pretty interesting. I pointed it out to my colleague that was with me. And then about 5 minutes later, the weka ran past the other direction. And lo and behold, the stoat was running after it. And I was like, geez, that was 5 minutes later. So I actually grabbed my rifle and ran over to the bank and saw the stoat swimming across the sort of back eddy of the river, obviously chasing the weka still, I presume. I never saw the weka. Anyway, I thought that was pretty interesting, and that sort of motivated me to get up and move around and get out of camp. So I grabbed the rifle about 20 minutes later and walked about 500 metres up the river to a bit of a log jam where I could overlook a clearing. It was too high to get across to the clearing, but the river was, in Fiordland, rivers drop literally 10 centimetres within an hour. So I knew I could get across there if I did see a deer and was able to shoot it. Anyway, I was sitting on top of the log looking up the river, and I heard a rustle behind me, and I saw a glimpse of the weka going through the crown fern. And I sort of looked over, and there was a stoat on the weka's back, latched onto its neck. And the weka ran under a log, and I jumped off the log and actually poked the barrel of my rifle under there thinking, well, maybe I can shoot this stoat or something. But it was literally a metre away from me, hidden under this log with the stoat on its back. And I didn't want to shoot it because I thought I might miss and kill the weka, which is obviously not a great idea. But then by doing that and poking the rifle barrel under there, it had spooked the weka, and the weka ran off and knocked the stoat off its back as it went under a log. And then the weka ran off, and I was like, right. And I put a round into the chamber and saw the weka running around. And there was a big sandy riverbank up in front of me, about 25 metres away. And the weka ran across, and I thought, well, based on experience of the last half an hour, that stoat's going to be chasing it. And it ran across the bank, and I shot the stoat. And stoat went up in the air, sand went everywhere. And I went over to check out the stoat. And I went to kick the stoat over, and the shot had completely disintegrated its midsection. And the stoat flipped over and bit into my shoe, after which I killed it. And I was just like, holy heck, like there was about a 35, 40-minute period of the stoat chasing and then getting on top of the weka, and then eventually I dispatched it. But that really brought home to me that I actually felt really kind of sad almost for the stoat. I was like, here's this predator that's so determined to kill this this quite, size of a chicken basically, and then it still had the guts to literally try and latch onto my shoe when I was trying to dispatch it. And I was just like, with that amount of determination, I can completely understand why New Zealand's fauna is at peril from those real apex killing machines, really. But the determination of the stoat, I was like, fair call, man. That's a pretty awesome species to be able to do that.
I think that story is such a good demonstration of how much we do need to help our native species, because they weren't built to survive these predators with claws and teeth. And if it's a fight, native species versus stoats, I'm on the native species side. Sorry, guys. What's something that happened in the field that still makes you laugh when you think about it?
I was with some friends and we went up to the Kārangarua, not the Kārangarua, the Copeland Hut actually, the Welcome Flat Hot Pools, which is a really popular destination. It was Queen's birthday weekend and I'd done a lot of work up there, so I threw the rifle in because I sort of know where there's a few chamois about up there, and we got to the hut and there was quite a few people, being Queen's birthday weekend in there, and we were about to go out for a hunt, and another party walked past and they were all, we'd sort of bumped into them earlier, they were all really keen to go and shoot something, and they had all the latest gear. They're obviously invested a bit of time into their sport, in terms of, maybe more money than time. Anyway, they went off up the track and my mate and I thought, we'll go and we'll just go past them and go and find a different spot to go. And I had a creek in mind that I'd been up before and seen a few chamois. And we came around the corner and had a quiet chuckle to ourselves as we saw these four hunters out in the middle of the Copeland River taking photos of each other, like sort of posing with their guns, and they were climbing up the bank and posing and taking photos of each other. And we thought, we'll leave them to it on their big hunt. And we walked up the river and only about another 10 minutes and walked up a side creek, and then I started to see a little bit of fresh sign, and I told my friend, I said, I'll get you, he had his video camera. I said, get your video camera around. I'm pretty sure there's something around here. And we literally walked about another 30 seconds up the riverbed and a chamois popped out and I shot it. And I said to him, I think that was actually quite a big chamois buck. I've shot quite a few chamois, and I sort of know what I'm looking at. And as I came over the ridge and saw this animal lying on the ground, it was a really, really big trophy buck, over 10 inches in length, which is what hunters are after if they're trying to get a chamois trophy. So we took the meat off it and went back to the hut, and I was at the door just cleaning up my gear, and these famous Instagram hunters came around the corner and they said, oh my God, where'd you get that? And I said, you know where you guys were crossing the river and taking photos of yourself? Just up the creek past there. And they sort of looked at me and I just laughed, and we carried on having a yarn. And actually they were really nice chaps, but yeah, it was one of those times where you do enough hunting, you get a bit of luck on your side, and you're able to sort of maybe gloat a wee bit in front of some people that thought they
that are doing it for the gram.
Yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant. You work in really remote areas. We talk to lots of different people who work in the field and take different things with them. Is there an unconventional essential item that you take with you, no matter what?
I wouldn't say it's unconventional. I'd say it's absolutely necessary when you're sharing tents or huts with people, and that's earplugs. I've worked with some horrendous snorers. Even just if it's a raging river outside your tent door, you just don't want to listen to it all night because you get stressed out, because you're like, is it going to flood?
Is it rising? Yeah.
Ignorance is bliss when you've got earplugs in. But yeah, I'm a bit of a grumpy field worker if I don't have at least 7 or 8 hours sleep, or if I have multiple crap nights in a row. I'm not as convivial as I may otherwise be. So yeah.
Now for what's become my favourite segment, our listener questions we ask out on social media, and we've got some brilliant ones in for you, George. So first up, you are a Fiordland expert. Have you seen the Fiordland moose?
No, I haven't. There was a sighting 2 years ago, a supposed sighting, but there no photographic evidence. And there have been other people that I know that have done possums in that particular area and reckon they might have seen a big print, but once again, no photographic evidence. And I suspect that, yes, maybe 10 or 15, 20 years ago, there may have been one or two moose left, but odds are, being a science man, the probabilities are very low, and I'd say that they're not there.
Very realistic point of view. What is your favourite flora species and why?
It's probably the Asaphila, and the Asaphila species, some people call it Spaniard. It's a really spiky alpine plant, and it's got, funny names like Asaphila horrida, because it's not the nicest species to brush your leg against or fall into. But I really love them. They've got a really beautiful flower that is protected by spikes all around it, but they are really long stems. Some of the plants are the base plant, so it sort of looks like a flax, but really spiky. It can be up to a metre in diameter, if not more. And they're just a beautiful plant. Bit of a pain in the ass, but a beautiful plant nevertheless.
That's awesome. It's a very unique one. I think the Māori name is Taramea as well. Is that the same one?
Yeah, cool. That is the same one.
All right. Thank you very much for your listener questions. Now on to our questions again. How did Doc manage deer?
So Doc has a sort of a prioritisation system, and it looks mainly at the species and the ecosystem values across the country. So we want to work in the most important places that are the most vulnerable, because simply we've got limited resources, so we have to protect those endangered species and ecosystems. So where those ecosystems and species are affected by deer or other wild animals, and the management of those animals is important to its success, we will manage it. So that's places like the Murchison Mountains, for example, where we have takahe present. We manage deer in that location to prevent the decline in the preferred takahe food species, so they're not influenced by a lack of food availability. So the department, looks across the country and at those really special places and ecosystems and decides whether it needs ungulate control or not, and we will do it if it's necessary and we have the resources to do it. Additionally, which not many hunters disagree with at all, is that we're trying to keep ungulates, pigs, deer, goats, etc., out of places where they aren't now. So we're trying to keep those few remaining parts of the public conservation land out there that don't have them. We're trying to keep them out of there so we can preserve those ecosystems and species within those. And it's much easier to keep animals out than it is to manage them once they're there. And that's the exception is our offshore islands, where there are a few offshore islands where we've managed to eradicate deer from, and they're pretty easy to keep out because obviously they don't swim to those islands very often, and they're pretty easy to keep at zero density or eradicate them from.
You said they don't swim to those islands very often. Do they swim to islands?
Yeah, they do swim. Deer have hollow hairs, so they've actually got some buoyancy in their pelts. So when they're able to swim, those hollow hairs keep them afloat a bit more, and they are able to cross quite large distances, up to a kilometre, if they're really keen to get somewhere. And there are places in the Marlborough Sounds where there were deer-free islands, such as Maud Island, and deer have swum over from the mainland, maybe 900 metres or close to a kilometre.
We're not even at the nature mind-blown fact yet, and I think we've just blown my mind. That's incredible. I had no idea about that. You mentioned before things that hunters agree with. How do we get the balance right between hunting and conservation? Sometimes there seem to be really opposite ends of the spectrum. So what do you say about that?
Well, with the knowledge that the department has finite resources and it has to manage, it manages its most threatened and endangered ecosystems and species, alongside containing the expansion of wild animals. It suddenly you start to look at maps, and it's actually a large area of public conservation land that doesn't receive any ungulate management. And the real control in those spaces comes from the commercial recovery sector, which is in the doldrums a little bit at the moment, and comes from recreational hunters. So there's a large proportion of public conservation land that I don't think there are any clashes with hunters over. I think deer and other ungulates are largely unmanaged in those spaces. So I actually think that the recreational hunting sector, as it has done in places like Fiordland with the Wapiti Foundation, can play an active role in protecting some of these areas and at least keeping animals at a density that aren't resulting in those really massive structural changes in our forests where we're getting, the conversion of tall forest to low stature shrubland through regeneration being prevented. So I think there is actual more space for more work to be done that involves and engages recreational hunters as well, that can be complementary to the places where DOC needs to manage them to really low densities, which isn't as complementary to what hunters want. So I think there's plenty of room for everything out there, all management styles, and I think hunters can play a really proactive role in that.
And there's a commercial element to hunting too. Would you explain how that plays in?
Yeah, I mean, the commercial sector in the past has shown that putting a value on a wild animal can really lower its numbers and have really good ecological benefits as well. So I think the commercial sector plays a vital role. And some of those hunter-led management projects that we see, that the control's not actually done by the recreational hunters. They just go in there to get the trophies and enjoy the experience. The control is often done by commercial recovery operators that work in partnership with the group managing that site. So I think commercial, having a value on wild animal products and meat, etc., is a really important aspect to good management of our forests and ecosystems, not only from a recreational hunter perspective, but obviously from DOC's perspective, and maintaining those, what we call lands held for the public, because our job is to try and protect those ecosystems and species. It is there to offer recreational hunting opportunities, etc., but in a well-managed situation where we're not going to have overabundant ungulates that are going to result in skinny deer that hunters don't want, low-quality trophies that hunters don't want, and stuffed native ecosystems, which nobody wants. So I think, there's plenty of room to move in that space, utilising commercial and recreational hunters alongside, DOC-led control and other agencies as well. There are other agencies that want to protect their ngāhere as well.
Awesome. So it's all about partnership. And yeah, you're right. Our job is to protect ecosystems and species at the end of the day. Do you always hunt from the ground, or are there aerial kind of aspects of this?
Yeah, so the department does ground and aerial hunting, and that really depends on the environment you're working within. So, for example, tahr management, because tahr live out in open alpine ecosystems and in very remote and rugged places, aerial control is the most cost-effective way of doing it. There is some ground control in areas, catchments that are forest covered, this is for tahr, and the same applies to deer. So it depends on what habitat you're trying to manage the species in. If it's forest, generally we're relying on ground hunters and ground hunters with dogs. If it's open habitat, it's often a lot quicker and more efficient to utilize helicopters and airborne technologies. And at the end of the day, we are responsible to the government and the taxpayer by choosing the most efficient and effective methods possible. So we'll choose whatever the most efficient and effective method is for the landscape and the species we're trying to work with.
Now, sometimes carbon is a really hot topic in the hunting space. Can you tell us about that? Explain that a bit.
Yeah, so there's sort of a couple of, I guess you could say, debates occurring in that sector. Do wild animals reduce carbon levels in our forests, and does wild animal control promote the generation of carbon, and what's the carbon cost of doing that wild animal control? Because as I was talking about earlier, we use helicopters and which are carbon hungry machines to run. So trying to understand those elements is relatively complex and tricky. We don't have many examples of where we've had really intensive animal control operations that have promoted the regeneration of carbon, with the exception of some of our island eradications, etc., and some of our intensively managed sites. So it is the debate Well, this, I wouldn't say it's a debate. It's more about the science to understand that problem is still in its infancy. However, I can say from personal experience, I have seen instances of places in the forest where when wind has blown down a large section, like maybe an acre of forest, or on the western coast of Fjorden, as I was saying earlier, where we've seen a big slip down into the ocean, and the regeneration of those tall woody species like our beech trees and that has been completely prevented. And there are anecdotes of that up in the central North Island as well, and the Raukumara, and obviously Cyclone Gabrielle came through and caused a lot of damage there. And the real interest is are those key woody species that provide that protective skin over our landscapes, is that able to regenerate? And obviously, the larger the tree, the more carbon it has. So that's a really important thing to understand. We've also got to add in possums as well, because deer prevent regeneration from the ground up. But possums will come in over the top, and they'll be killing trees from the top down. So it's broader than just deer. It's broader than just goats. It's that whole system and the impact that animal browsers have on it, and whether that's causing wholesale declines in carbon or not. My view is that at really high densities, as it probably does, but we actually do need a bit more data to support the argument either way. And we also need to understand how much it costs to get rid of those ungulates to be able to promote the regeneration of those species.
And is that work to gather that data being done?
Yeah, it is by the department and Te Ure Rako, the New Zealand Forest Service. There are multiple, Manaaki Whenua Land Care Research, there are multiple agencies interested in answering this question. So there is work being undertaken at the moment on it.
What is something about nature that blew your mind when you learned it?
One of it was, I actually mentioned earlier, like 2.5 million moa in New Zealand is just phenomenal. And I had heard stories about the goldfields in Central Otago, how gold miners used to go around and collect moa bones and burn them in their fires because that was the only source of wood. And other traders that would come out and sell vegetables, et cetera, to the miners out in Central Otago would backload out dray loads of moa bones that were grind up and used as fertiliser in their market gardens. So it's fascinating to really dive into the history of moa in New Zealand. They were wiped out within 100 years, but they were ubiquitous right throughout the landscape at densities that as I was saying, that deer and other ungulates are present in the landscape today. And there were massive areas of the eastern coast of the South Island littered with moa bones after this mass extinction event. And it just blows me away. And the fact that these big swamps that they interred these moa from, they're finding some of the giant eastern South Island Dinornis species of moa, they would have up to 5 kilos of rocks, which is like a laundry bucket full of rocks, all in your neck, in your 1.5 neck. So imagine wandering around with a dozen cricket balls in your throat, along with a bunch of pebbles there just to grind up this plant matter that you're eating all day. So, some of these, trying to imagine what New Zealand looked like, prior to human arrival with haast eagles around and moa quite, ubiquitous throughout the landscape is a pretty phenomenal kind of, it's a bit mind-bending in some respects.
Yeah. Absolutely. I've heard you say that one of your missions in life is to make people more aware of the loss that we're facing. That kind of segues well. Can you tell me about what that means to you?
Yeah, from an ungulate management perspective, it's talking about making our native ecosystems resilient to change. And as we know, in the face of climate change, we're going to see more extreme events that are going to damage our forests, our ngahere and our alpine ecosystems. Now, they're far more resilient if they can maintain that structural integrity along with, that blanket of whether it be tall tussocks or whether it be, a complex overstory of trees to prevent, rain erosion, et cetera, bind the soil together, prevent slips and things like that. Now, that can happen with ungulates present, but only present at moderate to low levels in the landscape. And what I'm really worried about at the moment is just that increasing number of ungulates around the Ngāhere that is preventing that regeneration, even of those less ice creamy, like more just standard bread and butter species, coming through and replacing the canopy and providing that protective layer over our soils and landscapes. And that's what my big worry is that we risk it sort of turning into something like Central Otago, where you've lost all your tussocks through pastoralism and fire and burning, etc., and you're now dealing with just straight high racium, low diversity landscapes. And that's what I want people to understand, that with no management, that's the road we're heading down. And alongside that are those potential carbon consequences as well. So that's the big one, is just to understand that, yes, we can have ungulates, but and in areas where DOC doesn't prioritise, it for conservation purposes, they're allowed to be there, but in really high numbers, it's going to provide problems for all of us, for the agricultural sector, for our streams and waterways, municipal water takes, etc., etc. So it's really just about understanding that it's not all or nothing. There can be middle ground in terms of having ungulates in the landscape, but at high levels, none of us want that.
How would you suggest we get people to care about the flora as much as the fauna?
I use the analogy of a supermarket. If we don't have a diverse supermarket out there, the structure of our forest providing that habitat for invertebrates, which are subsequently, our insectivorous birds feed on, etc., we're essentially eliminating aisles out of the supermarket. And some of those aisles are only turned on at certain times of year when those birds need a critical food source to promote their breeding success or putting on weight before winter, etc. And if they are not there, then our fauna is, much more vulnerable to stresses that limit their fertility or their production or their survival even. So without the forest and the vegetation and the flora, you cannot support a healthy and functioning fauna ecosystem. Not as charismatic, but essential.
I think you've said it really well. Thank you so much for coming in today and for myth busting all of this stuff to do with hunting and teaching us about flora being the architecture of the city. I might go and get that tattooed now. I think that's the coolest. Thanks, George.
No problem. Mā te wā.
Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Erica Wilkinson, and this has been the Doc Sounds of Science podcast. This show is available wherever you get your podcasts, or you can stream it off our website, doc.govt.nz. This show is produced by Jane Ramage with editing by Lucy Holyoke. If you enjoyed this episode, show us some love with a 5-star rating.